So let's get cracking. Now, one of the most amazing things that I found out when it came to the Dutch Navy was the fact that it is the oldest, well, one of the oldest navies in the entire world. It's been around for a long, long time. As a matter of fact, it's much older than the HMS Victory, which is the oldest ship that is currently still active today. As for the age of the Netherlands Navy, it was said to be founded on January 8th, 1488, which makes it over 500 years old. And the reason for this was simply due to the fact that the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian first issued the order to create a navy within the country in order to protect the commercial interests and trading of the country. And for this newly formed navy, the first admiral of it all was Lord of Ravenstein, Philip of Cleves. And of course, before this, the navy of the Dutch, they were known more as a private group rather than a government body. And the first admiral of that private group is thought to be a man named Jan Boek, who ran from 1383 to 1389. Now, jumping forward to what some historians say is the definitive moment for the Dutch Navy's introduction to the world was during the 80-Year War, which lasted from 1568 to 1648. It is also known as the Dutch Revolt, where Dutch communities from the lower countries formed their own rebelling groups and fought for their own independence against Philip II of Spain. It was during this time that these individual Dutch rebels created their own navy, in which they were called sea beggars. And one of the most notable battles during this time was the capture of Brielle on April 1st of 1572, in which, because of the Dutch victory, it created a light for the rest of the Dutch rebels, which eventually formed what is known as the Dutch Republic, that was established in 1581. Now, to jump a little bit further, in the 17th century, the 1600s, one thing that I found really impressive is the fact that the Dutch Navy had become one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful navies on the entire planet. As a matter of fact, this was even during the time they were still fighting the Spaniards. And to demonstrate that, the Dutch had sent ships to Gibraltar in 1607, which resulted in the Battle of Gibraltar, which occurred on April 27th. Now, this was a very, very significant battle for the Dutch Navy, because it was on that day 26 Dutch ships led by Jacob van Heemskerk cruised right into the Bay of Gibraltar and absolutely devastated the main fleet of the Spanish Navy, which for this fleet consisted of 21 to 22 ships, and 10 of them were being massive fleet killers known as the galleons. And although most of the Spanish fleet was destroyed, the war went on till 1648, which was the year the Dutch Republic finally became recognized in the world. And although the 80-Year War had come to a close, combat for the Dutch Navy was far from over. It was because during this time, they had not only the biggest fleet, but they also had the strongest and most amount of merchant ships, and controlled much trade around the world. And of course, for the British and the French, they didn't like that all too much. And because the English and French had problems with the trade deals, it resulted in what is known as the First Anglo-Dutch War, which spanned 4 wars in total, and was a war that primarily consisted of Navy combat. It's also interesting to know that the first battle that started this particular war was known as the Battle of Goodwin Sands, which resulted in the Commonwealth declaring war on July 10th of 1552. Now, what's interesting about this battle is this one started out of the fact that the Dutch gave a lack of respect to the British. Because during that time, the British wanted absolute respect on all the waters, and they demanded that flags be striked when ships met. However, it was on May 29th, 1652, when the Dutch Lieutenant Admiral Martin Tromp refused to strike his flag, which began the first battle of the Anglo-Dutch War. However, unfortunately for the Dutch Navy, they became cornered by the French and English forces, and eventually lost the title of having the most powerful navy in the world, which resulted in the Dutch having to allow ships to pass through the East Indies for free. And it was at that point that the Royal Navy of Britain became the most dominant force on the planet. Now, let's fast forward a little bit more, because a lot of the modern form of the Netherlands is based off of stuff that happened in the 1800s. Because by 1850s, new technologies such as turrets and propellers had come into the Navy, making old ship line techniques outdated. Of these new ships were the Prins Hendrik der Nederlanden and the Koning der Nederlanden, which were classified as turret and ram ships. It should also be noted that the Koning was the largest in the fleet and was also the largest warship in the entire world during the 1800s. Of course, by the 1910s, this is when the Netherlands started to receive use submarines. And although by the time of the Second World War, the Dutch Navy had no form of battleships or cruisers, but that doesn't mean that they weren't planning on making them. For the Netherlands, there was actually plans to build what is known as Project 1047, a battle cruiser in response to the Japanese threat. And it was actually the last ship that was in design phases before the Germans invaded the country and occupied it in February of 1940. It also should be mentioned that during the Second World War, they were honored for what they did at Dunkirk. This is because the Dutch Navy was in charge of escorting and assisting in the evacuations of the British and Canadian forces, which resulted in them saving thousands of lives. And among many of the battles that the Dutch Navy took part of, one of the most significant ones was the Battle of Java. And unfortunately for this particular battle, many Dutch forces were lost against the Imperial Japanese Navy. But one in particular was the HNLMS De Ruyter, where Rear Admiral Karel Doorman chose to go down with his own ship after being torpedoed. As well, in between the months of February and April 1942, the Dutch had lost 20 ships of its navy, which almost annihilated the entire navy in the Asian campaigns. Now, since the war, the Netherlands has changed its tactics. By being a part of NATO, the Netherlands Navy is currently part of NATO squadrons, such as the Standing Naval Force Atlantic. Now, as of today, they have 4 submarines, which are known as the Walrus class, and are diesel and electric submarines that have been in operation since the 1990s. Also, I just want to mention that when it comes to the entire history of the Netherlands Navy, they've owned 56 submarines in total. And apparently it's a tradition in the submarine division that when you go on your last voyage, you are to throw your shoes overboard. As well, for destroyers, they have the De Zeven Provinciën class frigates, which were acquired in the early to mid 2000s, and they are named after the De Zeven Provinciën, which was the flagship for Michael de Ruyter. For frigates, they have 2 of them, which are known as the Karel Doorman class frigates, named after Rear Admiral Karel Doorman, who went down with his ship during the Battle of Java. Of course, they have 4 offshore Holland Patrol class vessels, and all of this falls under the commander of the entire Navy, and that is Vice Admiral Rob Kramer. And the United States itself, although it has a very small history compared to other countries around the world, for example, Sweden has had a much larger history. The thing about some of the facts and history of the US Navy is there is a lot of it for such a short amount of time. And I just want to clarify that that's not me downplaying the United States' naval history length or comparing it to other countries, it's just the simple facts. Speaking about facts, let's get right into it. Let's look at the very first fact that I can think of. And that is the original starting point of the United States Navy. Now, one thing about this is the original date, the starting point, and even location is somewhat debated. Pretty much you have 2 cities that have been arguing back and forth for decades about which city founded the US Navy. However, most historians pretty much acknowledge the fact that Marblehead was the original founding location. This is because Marblehead was home to the first ever armed schooner, and that was the USS Hannah. This particular craft was armed with 4 4-pounder guns and was aimed to thwart off British ships. Originally commissioned by George Washington, it was acquired on August 24th, 1775. Now, one thing that historians do know, and this is where you kind of get into the debate, is the Hannah was transferred to Beverly, and that's why Beverly's like, no, we are the ones that created the Navy. However, unfortunately, this ship did not have a long life because she eventually ran aground on October 10th of that year. And another unfortunate fact is there's not a lot of information of what happened to the ship afterwards, whether or not it was scrapped or destroyed. They don't really know. One thing that they do know is shortly after that, on October 13th, the government had ordered 2 new ships with guns, creating the Navy for the United States of America. Basically, in history, you had battleships that were named after the states, you had cruisers that are named after the cities, and destroyers that are named after famous American naval leaders or leaders in general. And as a matter of fact, that system for the destroyers is still honored today. However, submarines, though, they are a little bit different because for them, they've been named after cities and states and all that sort of stuff. And on top of that, you have aircraft carriers, which are generally named after presidents. And for some of these that are named after individuals, such as the destroyers, one thing that's really kind of a tradition is that the oldest living female relative of that person that they are naming the ship after has to christen the ship. It's really kind of an old tradition that they still do today. Speaking about submarines, let's mention the fact that all submarines and submarine service is completely volunteer. That's right, the United States Navy does not force any individual to go into submarine service. And of course, if one was to sign up, they really do look into this and they go through a lot of tests to see if you are to fit the bill. And also in history, women were never part of the submarine service because they were like, well, there's no privacy, that sort of thing. But however, much has changed because women do actually serve as submariners, and the first female submariner was Britta W. Christensen. She became the first dive officer of the watch, and she held the rank of supply officer lieutenant. Also, for submarines, the job is really quite demanding that you actually get 4 meals a day. That's pretty nice. I also want to just mention the fact that that was kind of like 3 facts in 1 fact. That's why we call it 10 plus facts. And speaking about facts, by the way, I did mention it earlier, but this is a part of our U.S. military playlist, which I've done a few videos. I've talked about the Navy SEALs, and I'm doing other topics in the future. And I'm just going to put a card in this video for you guys to check out. It's also going to be in the description box below. All right, so here's the next really interesting fact. Remember how I said that the Navy started back in like 1775? Well, here's an interesting fact. The Navy was not continuous from that starting point. As a matter of fact, it stopped at some point in history. This happened in 1785 after the American Revolutionary War, where the entire Navy was disbanded. Partially because the US had sold all their ships, they didn't think that they really needed them, and on top of that, they didn't really have the budget for it either. But however, by 1794, things had gotten out of hand with the piracy in the Barbary states, which are in Africa. To deal with this, America had to build themselves a new fleet, and thus they created the Naval Act of 1794, thus giving us the second day of the Navy's creation. And you may think to yourself, 1794, yeah, that's cool, they got their own admirals. Well, actually, believe it or not, they didn't have an official admiral until much later. The first admiral for the Navy wasn't until July 16th of 1882. This was known as David Glasgow Farragut, in which he was granted Rear Admiral on that particular day. Before that, if you had a high rank in the Navy, you were considered what is known as a flag officer. However, that was kind of a temporary sort of rank until they decided what official ranks they wanted to adopt. Now, I mentioned this before. I was talking about aircraft carriers, and for me, I think aircraft carriers are some of the coolest pieces of hardware that the US Navy has. As a matter of fact, one of the coolest things was when I was working on a cruise ship, I actually managed to see an aircraft carrier way off into the distance. And the reason I knew it was an aircraft carrier is because its hangar doors were open, and I was like, can see right through it. That's an aircraft carrier. That, and the guy that was also part of the Navy that was on board was like, yep, there's one right there. Rare to see, but there it is. And of course, for some people who aren't too familiar with the US Navy, they may think, oh yeah, aircraft carriers came around in the Second World War. That wasn't the case. They were actually around prior to that. The first aircraft carrier for the country was the USS Langley. It was also the US's first turbo-electric powered ship that was converted from a bulk collier ship named the USS Jupiter. The USS Jupiter was built in 1912, and the refit into an aircraft carrier for the USS Langley was commissioned on March 20th, 1920. Side note, and this also moves on to my next fact, but this is still about aircraft carriers. Did you know that James T. Kirk from the show Star Trek was originally going to command the USS Yorktown? Instead of it being the USS Enterprise, which we all now commonly know, the USS Yorktown was going to be named after the great aircraft carrier from the Second World War that went down after being struck by a Japanese sub on June 6, 1942. However, this was changed to the USS Enterprise in kind of honor to the new USS Enterprise aircraft carrier. This aircraft carrier was the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, which started construction in 1957 and was launched on September 24th, 1960. So Gene Roddenberry kind of just said, you know what, with this new ship out there, we just kind of want to, be honorable. We're going to rename the Yorktown to the USS Enterprise. Also, the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier was named after the Second World War USS Enterprise, which was also an aircraft carrier. Kind of confusing. It was known as the Big E. You've probably heard that before. And it was one of only 3 aircraft carriers that survived the Second World War that was built before the war started. Speaking about ships and large ones, let's talk about submarines. The biggest one of these that the USA has ever made was the Ohio-class submarine. Although it is the third biggest submarine in the world, coming in at a total length of 170 meters or 560 feet, currently it is under the Typhoon or Aquila-class submarine, which actually I did a video about that. I'll also put that in the description box below for you guys to check out. Really cool submarine. I mean, it was armed to the teeth with nukes. It was insane. However, unlike the Russian Typhoon Aquila class, the United States had more of these Ohio-class submarines, and all of them are actually still in use today. Originally, they had plans to build 24 of them, but they only had 18 built. And in today's world, they are capable of firing 24 Trident 1C4 missiles, in which each one is loaded with 8 100-kiloton warheads. Just imagine what it would be like if all 18 of those babies fired at once. No wonder why the Cold War was very, very serious. All right, let's jump back to big things that are on the surface, and that is battleships. I love them. Now, similar to aircraft carriers, they have also been around for quite a long time. As a matter of fact, the first one was the USS Texas. She was launched on June 28th, 1892, and we all know Texas is big because if that name didn't foreshadow the future of the battleships, then I don't know what would. Because, let's be real, World War II was where you saw the biggest, the most powerful battleships in the entire world, and we will probably never ever see anything like that ever again. One of the largest of these with the most amount of firepower was the USS Iowa, which also spawned the Iowa-class battleships, in which they had 6 of them. Most of these battleships obviously served in the Pacific to bombard little islands that the Japanese had occupied. But as for the USS Iowa, it was the only Iowa-class battleship to serve in the Atlantic Ocean. The USS Iowa is now a museum, and during the height of the Second World War, they had approximately 2,700 sailors on board this type of battleship. And for their size, when I meant they were big, they were huge. Coming in at a length of 860 feet long with a width beam of 108 feet. Of course, for my American friends out there, this is a length of 262.13 meters and a width or beam of 32.97 meters. Also, and the fact there is a bit of a debate that most people might not be up to date with, and that is whether or not the USA still has battleships in its Navy. Well, for a long time, I actually thought that this was true. I heard that they had 4 of these in reserve, but as of 2014, not anymore. But however, it's interesting to know that the United States was the last country to have these battleships in reserve until their names were struck from the Naval Registry. Nowadays, though, most of these battleships have been turned or transferred into museums, but did you know that the United States is the only North American country to have battleships as museums? As a matter of fact, they're one of 3 countries in the entire world to have battleships as a viewing thing for the public. Japan has the Mikasa, and there is one in China, but it is classified as a replica. So first of all, the Swedish Navy and all its ships have the prefix HMS, which means basically Her Majesty's ship. Which, I don't know about you guys, but when I first saw that fact, I was like, this has got to be a lie because, no, HMS stands for Her Majesty's ship for the British, not for the Swedish. Well, actually, it is for the Swedish as well. And therefore, most of the English actually identify Swedish ships as HSWMS, which stands for His or Her Swedish Majesty's ship. Which may make you think which one actually theoretically came first, the Brits or the Swedes? Well, theoretically it was the Swedish. Because as for them, their navy was founded on June 7th, 1552, which was prior to Britain's navy being founded in 1546. So like a 20-year difference. Which, by the way, guys, we're not comparing the two. This is just all about Sweden and that's that. However, truth be told, this date is only realistically what modern people kind of identify it as. Realistically, Sweden had a navy well before. I mean, of course, if you include the Vikings, they totally did as well. But as a matter of fact, the early kings did have naval forces as far back as the 9th century. But as for June 7th, 1522 being the founding date, it is because this was when Sweden was separated from the Kalmar Union, and when Gustav Vasa, the king of Sweden at the time, ended up buying a fair amount of ships for his navy from the German town of Lübeck. Now you may think to yourself, Sweden in today's world is a very peaceful place, but back then it really wasn't. As a matter of fact, it had a lot of conflict, and from the get-go of having this navy, they were already fighting the Danish. It was nuts. For example, one of the first, if not the first battle under this newly formed navy was in November of that year of 1522, and it was called the Battle of Sandhamn-Sloppet. Also, I should point out one of the first admirals of this new fleet was Admiral Jacob Bagge, who was surprisingly a Norwegian that sympathized with the Swedes and therefore fought for them. As for Admiral Jacob Bagge, he was considered one of Sweden's most experienced admirals, and it was him and his fleet that took part in the Battle of Bornholm, which was the first battle of the Northern Seven-Year War, which went from 1563 to 1570. In which during that battle, Sweden had claimed a victory by attacking the 10 Danish ships with its 19 ships. Also, some of you guys, you might be either enthusiasts or you just may know some common knowledge, and you may think that the Vasa was one of the biggest ships back in the day. Well, actually, it wasn't. The Vasa, which indeed was a very large ship and one of Sweden's largest, was launched in 1627 and sank in 1628. However, in 1961, it was recovered, and nowadays it's a museum, so that's what makes it very popular. But that wasn't the biggest ship. As a matter of fact, there was one that was even larger, and that was the warship known as Mars. I'm not talking about the planet. As a matter of fact, it's a very small planet. They should have just called it Earth, because, you know, you get it? Size difference? Yay! Everybody knows astronomy. Or astrology. I forget which one it is. Now, this was the lead ship of Erik XIV of Sweden's fleet, and it had at least 107 guns and was over 200 feet in length. And this was one of the largest ships in the entire world of its time. Sweden had some good stuff going for it. And just like the Vasa, this ship unfortunately had a very short life, entering in service in 1564, but sank that same year after it caught a fire during the Battle of Åland. So, the Battle of Åland, also, I gotta mention the fact, now this, I don't know if it's 100% true. Keep in mind, guys, this is history I'm talking about. This is way back then, and I don't know if it's 100% true, but apparently it was the first time in history that admirals used cannons to sink other ships instead of boarding them. Bit of an update in regards to the ship known as Mars. In 2011, her wreck was discovered, and in 2018, it was confirmed that this ship was in fact the Mars, as they found coins that were minted with Erik's seal that were prior to 1563. Okay, let's fast forward a little bit more. Let's go to 1763, okay? During this time, Sweden had created what is very well known as the Archipelago Fleet. And this fleet existed until about 1823, and during the end of the 1700s, they had a fleet size of 285 ships that were armored. On top of that, they had an estimation of 320 officers, 675 NCOs, and approximately 6,000 sailors. This fleet was also identified with the blue flag with 3 tails on the end, and it was present during the wars of the 7-Year War, the Russo-Swedish War, the Finnish War, and the Swede-Norwegian War. And within this fleet, there was the Himima-class ship, which was considered the largest, most heavily armed vessel of the entire fleet. And throughout their entire forces, they had about 6 of these. However, by 1814, things kind of came to an end when it came to the Swedish military being an offensive military. It was because of this year, after its campaign against Norway, it entered a union with the country. And after that, Sweden had reflected on its history of combat and its almost 200-year-old war with Denmark, and decided that the country was no longer going to fuel war and remain fairly neutral. So let's fast forward just a little bit more. Let's go into the 1900s, because we all know the 1900s was, whoa, a crazy time for Europe. I mean, you had World War I, you had World War II, you had the Cold War and all that stuff. The question is, did Sweden fight? Did the Navy even do anything? So during World War I, Sweden actually had a lot of naval defense ships. As a matter of fact, its navy was considered the best in Scandinavia, and it was not far behind countries like Spain and even the Netherlands. Also, did you know that Thorsten Nordenfeldt was a Swedish submarine maker, and his ship, the Nordenfeldt I, which was bought by the Ottomans and renamed Abdul Hamid, was the first submarine to fire a live torpedo underwater. So there you have it, guys. Boom! Sweden just takes another strike. Yeah, just because they're neutral doesn't mean they can't contribute to the world. To jump back to World War I, most of the Navy was not just ships, but they also had many forts and guns that were put under the naval departments. At the beginning of World War I, Sweden had 12 battleships, 7 cruisers, 8 destroyers, 8 submersibles, 49 torpedo boats, 8 coastal monitors, and much more. And throughout the war, Sweden was pretty much keeping a monitor on its own defense and as well defending merchant ships that were going through the channels. By the Second World War, however, Sweden had approximately 97 warships, and of this, 16 were also classified as submarines. Unfortunately, during the Second World War, most of the technology and the ships of Sweden were over 10 years old, so they were a little bit outdated. Similar to the First World War, they acted as protection against Russian and other forces in the Baltic Sea, and it's said that Sweden escorted a total of 10,340 ships in 1942 alone. As well, let's not forget about the famous disaster known as the Hartsfjorden disaster, in which 3 destroyers were sunk and 33 sailors were killed. This was actually considered the worst naval accident in all of Sweden throughout the Second World War, and still to this day they have no friggin' idea how it happened. As a matter of fact, just a random explosion went off and they still don't know what caused it. There's some theories. Some people say there was sabotage. Some people say a plane that was training accidentally dropped a bomb. But other than that, guys, they don't really know. I mean, let's get those investigators on it, right? Now, on top of that, during the First and Second World War, Sweden didn't just act as protection. As a matter of fact, they laid a lot of mines within the Baltic Sea. As a matter of fact, during the defense of Finland, they say that there was approximately 300 naval mines and 500 depth charges that Sweden provided. And by the end of the Second World War, it was estimated that Sweden lost approximately 1,500 sailors. And although Sweden was heavily influenced by Nazi Germany, they did make efforts to help the Allied forces. And with that, they say during World War II, Sweden leased approximately 8,000 sailors or seamen to Britain. And of course, after World War II, Sweden decided it really needed to up its defense budget and get newer craft and vehicles and all that sort of stuff. And from there on, there was the Cold War, which Sweden again was on the defensive and keeping an eye on things in the Baltic and its own defense. As a matter of fact, the Swedish Navy did not partake in any international operations until October of 2006, when they sent 2 ships at separate times for coastal observations in the peacekeeping missions in Lebanon. And shortly after that, in 2008, it assisted the United Nations in the movement to stop piracy in Somalia by sending 3 ships to the south of the Gulf of Aden. However, again, 2008 was years ago. I mean, that's like 10 years ago. So what's it like now? Well, in today's world, they have approximately 5 submarines. However, the 2 Södermanland class submarines that they currently have are going to be replaced by 2022 by a ship that has the codename A-26. On top of that, you have the 3 Gotland-class submarines, which were the first to have the world-famous Stirling engine air-independent propulsion, which makes this submarine capable of staying underwater for not just days, but weeks. Prior to that, the only type of submarine that could do that was a nuclear class. Actually, by the way, you might be thinking, oh yeah, they're electric diesel, they're a bit outdated. Well, that's not the case at all. As a matter of fact, they're superior in many ways. Because it was only a few years ago that the United States invited Sweden to a war game with their submarines, and the real purpose of this war game was to discover how effective they were at hunting down electric diesel engines. Pretty much, they found out that they weren't good at it at all because the Swedish submarine managed to take several photos of the ship, which basically meant they could have got a torpedo strike on it and therefore sunk the ship. But getting back to its inventory, they currently have 7 corvettes that are in use. They also have 9 minesweepers, 13 patrol boats, and 152 combat boats, which 147 of these are the Strillboat 90s, which are a very common boat in Scandinavia. As for the size of this navy, it is really hard to say. There is no official number that has been released yet. However, all these sailors are under the command of Rear Admiral Jens Nyqvist since 2016, and they currently have 3 main bases being in Berge, Gothenburg, and Karlskrona.
Now, on the global military power scale, Nepal ranks 120th in the world. Its military is mostly made up of ground forces of the Nepalese army and is organized into 6 different combat divisions. The Nepalese Armed Forces also operates the smaller Nepalese Army Air Service. The military of Nepal operates on a volunteer basis with a total population of just under 30 million people. So out of that total population, the available manpower of Nepal is 14,739,923. When it comes to total military personnel, they have approximately 95,000, and that's the same number they have for active personnel. However, Nepal's military doesn't have any reserve personnel. When we look at the military branches, Nepal's military has three main military branches, and that's the Nepalese Army, and this includes the Nepalese Army Air Service, as well as they have the Nepalese Armed Police Forces, and in addition to that, they have the Nepalese Police Force. Now, as I mentioned, the command of the Nepalese Army is divided up into 6 divisions, and all of them are responsible for certain regions, and those divisions are the Far Western Division, and they have their headquarters in Depayal. Then there's the Midwestern Division, and their headquarters are in Surkhet. Then we have the Western Division, and their headquarters are in Pokhara. They also have the Mid Division, and its headquarters are in Hetada. Also, the Valley Division's headquarters are in Kathmandu. And finally, we have the Eastern Division, and its headquarters are located in Itahari. The president is the Supreme Commander-Chief of the Nepalese Army, and the National Defense Council, which includes the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, as well as the Home Minister, and 3 other ministers appointed by the Prime Minister, which recommends to the Council of Ministers ideas as well as plans for the mobilization, operation, and the use of the Nepalese army. Nepal is also known for the Gurkhas, which is definitely something that I should do a separate video on completely. So guys, actually let me know if you want to see a video just about the Gurkhas. Press that like button on this video.
It's our merch check. Navies are out.
So who are the Gurkhas? Well, they are soldiers who are greatly feared, and they use the kukuri, which is their signature blade. Now, Gurkhas are native to Nepalese nationality and ethnic Nepalese of Indian nationality. They were recruited for service in the British Army, the Nepalese Army, the Indian Army, as well as the Singapore Gurkha Reserve Unit, as well as they're called upon to join UN peacekeeping forces, as well as various war zones around the world. Now, they have a reputation for being super fearless. You see, it was once said, if a man says he is not afraid of dying, he is either lying or is a Gurkha. Let's now take a look at the specifics of the military equipment that Nepal has in its possession. When it comes to the air power, they have a total aircraft strength of 15. Nepal doesn't have any fighter aircraft or any attack aircraft. They do, however, have 2 transport aircraft, but they don't have any trainer aircrafts. Now, their total helicopter strength sits at 13. However, they do not have any attack helicopters in their possession. So as you probably realize by now, Nepal doesn't have a separate air force, but it flies several aircraft within the Nepalese Army Air Service, which is also known as the Nepal Army Air Wing. And the main objective of the Nepalese Army Air Service is for transport, flying paratroopers, and assistance in case of any sort of emergency. Now, the Nepal Army Air Service has a flying and helicopter pilots training school, and it was established in the year 2004. This school trains Army Air Service pilots as well as civilian pilots. Now let's take a look at the land strength of Nepal. So the Nepalese Army, aka the Gorkhali Army, is a military land force of Nepal, and they have their headquarters in Kathmandu. Now, the Armed Police Force of Nepal is a paramilitary land force responsible for counterinsurgency operations that take place in Nepal. Nepal's army doesn't have any combat tanks in their possession. Now, their armored fighting vehicles total 214. There are no self-propelled artillery, but they do have towed artillery, which total at 84. but they don't have any rocket projectors in their possession. So now, when it comes to the naval strength of Nepal, their total naval assets are at 0. So you see, Nepal is a landlocked country, meaning that all of its borders are surrounded by other countries. In their case, it's China and India. So that's a huge contributing factor to why Nepal does not have a navy. Nepal's defense budget is also better spent elsewhere. You see, Nepal has a security pact with India, and they have a great relationship with China. So with two powerful neighbors like China and India who are ready to support Nepal when it comes to times of aggression or anything, why would they invest in a navy? However, it's not to say that a landlocked country shouldn't have a navy or doesn't need one. I'm just speaking specifically in terms of Nepal's situation. Nepal's entire military is funded on a defense budget of $210 million. That's when you translate it into US dollars.